And good morning and welcome to our continuing journey on the Gospel Trail. Today we're in Matthew chapter 14, and we might get as far as part of Luke chapter 9. If not, then Luke chapter 9 is where we're going to go next week. The Gospel Trail, as I have mentioned, is an actual place. That's why we have this artwork over here. That's a replica of the sign that they put on stones for people who want to go and actually hike the trail that starts in Nazareth and roams through many of the places in the Galilee region that Jesus was known to have ministered to. And the physical Gospel Trail ends up at the Sea of Galilee in Capernaum, which was Jesus's ministry headquarters. But our Gospel Trail VBS, which this is the adult and youth version of it, is going to take the Gospel Trail a little bit further than the actual physical trail, because we're going to go from Galilee towards Jerusalem. Jesus reaches the end of his public ministry, and we're going to read in the Gospels that he firmly set his face toward Jerusalem and began to go there, knowing that that's where he was going to die for the sins of the world. So our Bible study is not going to end up at Capernaum. We're going to go from Capernaum on down towards Jerusalem before we conclude ours. Over here on the board, real briefly, I'll have him turn the camera there for a minute. She's back there if you want to carry him back. Some people who are watching this will recognize the source of it. I used to be director of religious education for the military post nearby, and so I handled all denominations, Sunday schools, and religious education activities. And this particular map came out of one of our Catholic Sunday school classes. It's a very good little map, easy to see, and it's at least got it right. It calls it the Holy Land. You may recall a few weeks ago, I put up a map by a major Christian publisher that had the map incorrectly labeled because it called it Palestine in the time of Christ. And the area was not called Palestine until 102 years after the time of Jesus. And that's because the Romans were still in power, and they were at that point in their history trying to erase any knowledge from the world of the fact that this land had ever been ruled by Jewish people. So the Holy Land is a good and correct name for it. And of course, because this was a children's Sunday school map, it's got the major highlights of what happened. You've got Bethlehem with the birth of Christ. You've got Jerusalem, where Jesus will pay for the sins of mankind at the cross. It has the Emmaus Road, where Jesus will appear to two of his followers who are headed home from Jerusalem after Jesus' crucifixion, and they think it's over. They don't understand what happened. They were sure Jesus was the Messiah, but they don't know what to do with the fact that he died until he walks along with them, resurrected, and they finally realize who it is. And then the rest of it deals with the Jordan River, and this one's got it a little bit too high, actually. The actual site of Jesus' baptism by John would be closer here to where this crease line is, closer to the entrance to the Dead Sea. Why? Because that's not too far from Jerusalem. That's where John was out in the wilderness preaching. If you ever get a chance to go on a tour of Israel, there are two places where tourists are allowed to either be baptized initially if they have never been baptized, or to reenact their baptism in the waters of the Jordan River. One of them is down here, which is the actual baptismal site. And then there's another one that's up here just south of where the Jordan River is coming out of the Sea of Galilee. A lot of people like to go there. The water is very, very clean. It is just pristine, and it is a wonderful place to go and get a baptism done. And then, of course, Jesus' hometown of Nazareth. Most of what we have been dealing with on this Gospel Trail, looking at Jesus' miracles, are things that occurred on this side and up to here, and on the Sea of Galilee itself. There are a few of Jesus's teachings and miracles that occur on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. So that's just an easy visual for you on where Jesus spent most of his time. Sometimes when you're reading the Gospels and Jesus has healed someone, he'll tell them, shh, don't tell anybody. Usually it's because it's closer to Jerusalem, where the religious leaders have already made up their minds that they're going to reject Jesus because they don't want to upset the apple cart of their position and their power. Jesus is going to do a lot of healings up this way. And very often he'll tell people, go ahead, go to Jerusalem, present yourself to the priest, have them pronounce you cured, particularly if it was something like leprosy, and fulfill the law. He did not come to abolish the law. He came to fulfill it and to correct the misunderstandings that they had been told about it. What we're looking at today, we looked a little bit at it last week as we've been in this little section between Matthew 10 and 14, where John the Baptist was in prison. John would have been in prison right over here, not too far from where he baptized Jesus, on the eastern side of the Jordan River in what today would be the country of Jordan, because Herod has him imprisoned for telling the truth. Herod has been called out for his unlawful taking of his late brother's wife, and Herod's had him in prison, but Herod doesn't want him put to death. So John's been languishing in the prison, and he's hearing about what Jesus is doing, and because he's going through a rough time himself, he's starting to question why, what's going on, what does the future hold. And so he sent last week 2 of his disciples up to where Jesus was in the Galilee to ask a question. Are you really the one, or should we look for someone else? And Jesus' reply to those 2 disciples, go back and tell John what you see, that people are being healed, that the lame are being able to walk, the blind are able to see, the deaf able to hear. Go back and tell him, because Jesus expected John, when he got that message over here, to understand that yes, Jesus is doing everything that their scriptures had told them that Messiah was going to be able to do. So that would be the comforting answer to John. John's going to get beheaded in the prison. Herod puts himself in a box. He promises his stepdaughter, who is also his niece. She has just performed a very seductive dance at his request at this big party that has a lot of highly intoxicated men there. And he promised her whatever she asked for because he was so pleased by her performance in the dance. And the girl, prompted by her mother, asked for John the Baptist's head on a platter. John is going to be executed. He doesn't get out of prison except by way of death. But Jesus will go on to describe John as being, there's no one on earth greater than John among ordinary men. So we're up still in the Sea of Galilee region, but before we conclude this particular study and move on to our next Bible study, we're going to go beyond where the gospel trail ends right here, and we're going to come back down towards Jerusalem to see Jesus being willing to see the plan of God all the way through, even though it means death on the cross, and he's going to overcome death. So now we'll come back to the table, and you can turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 10. Matthew chapter 14. My Bible was set in the wrong place. I've just described to you how Matthew 14 opens up with John being beheaded. Then it goes on to describe Jesus feeding the 5,000. The gospel accounts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all 3, tell a lot of similar stories. That's why they're called the synoptic gospels. So I'm just going to briefly highlight the feeding of the 5,000 because we have already discussed it in one of our Bible studies as part of this gospel trail. That when Jesus heard what had happened to John, that John has been martyred for the faith. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Sometimes you just need a time to get away and be alone and not have to deal with people. Jesus is having that kind of moment. He is fully human and he is also fully God. So you have to have that moment when you're recharging your own batteries, when you're resting, when you're letting God speak to you. Because whatever you're trying to tell yourself and whatever your well-meaning friends and family may be trying to tell you just isn't what you need at that moment. Sometimes you just need to be alone with God. But the crowds are so eager to get healing for themselves and their loved ones, to hear these wonderful teachings, because they're not getting this kind of teaching from their religious leaders, that they're not going to give Jesus the break that he is seeking here. Hearing this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. He just needed a little time off. But the crowds followed him, and rather than turn them away and saying, guys, I just need a few minutes to myself, or I need a break, he looked on them, and tired as he was in spirit, and tired as he probably was physically as well, come. Because Jesus won't turn away anyone who is truly seeking him. He had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, this is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go in the village and find themselves some food. Jesus replied, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. We only have here the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. And we know from other gospel accounts that it was Andrew who had found a boy whose mother had packed him a lunch that was just the 5 little, probably barley cakes, not much bigger than a biscuit, and 2 small fish. And that Philip, who is from Bethsaida, he's from very nearby where this is occurring. Philip is looking around and he's like, you want us to feed these people? Where could we find bread to feed so many? Ironically enough, as it turns out, this morning, just minutes before the camera was turned on, we were sitting here in the church fellowship hall, which is where our class is being conducted, and we're making plans for a couple of fellowship meals. It's coming up on the anniversary, the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks on America. And as it happens, there is a volunteer fire department literally across the street from the church. And we have several people who are in our church who are members of the volunteer fire department. And we decided as a church, we want to do something to recognize and honor those people who are volunteering to put themselves in harm's way to go and take care of our community whenever there's a fire or there's some sort of a paramedic type need where somebody may be drowning or maybe having a heart attack, that kind of thing. Those first responders come and they take care of things. So we're planning a way to honor them, and naturally it's going to involve food. Plus we're planning a couple of other church events that'll be happening in the coming months. Well, the good news is we're looking at the calendar and we're planning ahead. This is July, but it's really not too early to start planning what we want to do for a fall break, for the Thanksgiving season, for the Christmas season, because in order to really have programs go well, they need to be thought out, planned. You need to decide what's going to be done, who needs to do it, how much money do we have to do it, all the kinds of logistics that go into having a successful event. You certainly don't want to throw an event where there's food and run out of food before you run out of people in the line. You want to make sure you've got something tucked away that if the line is longer at the serving tables than what you see food on the table, that you've got some kind of plan in place to produce food. Well, in the first century, they don't have the ability to order up pizzas at the last minute, or maybe have a few hot dogs or some beef stew or something stuck away in the pantry that you could just put on the stove and heat and eat real quick. This is a huge crowd. They have been so eager to follow Jesus that even though he and his disciples got in the boat and went like from the southern part of the western side to the northern part, they followed on foot. They can see them out there on the lake. The Sea of Galilee is a giant lake. They can see where the boat's going. And they're walking the long way around, all they can do, to go see which direction that boat is headed. And it's been a long day, and everybody's tired, and everybody's hungry, and the disciples want Jesus to tell them, time to go. Have a benediction. Go find yourself some food and go find some place to rest the night so that they and Jesus could be alone and rest. And Jesus just startled them by saying, don't send them away. You feed them. And they're like, huh? If you're planning on feeding people, you need to know about how many people you want to feed. They're looking around and they're seeing the size of this crowd, and it is way bigger than anything we would be able to plan here at our small country church on the outskirts of Enterprise. There are thousands of people following Jesus, and they're looking around at the enormous crowd. And even though they've got 4 known fishermen among them, if those boys dumped everybody out of the boat, went out fishing, and got the catch of a lifetime, it still wouldn't be enough to feed 5,000 people. That's a task nobody wants to just sign up for and say, oh yeah, I'll be responsible for seeing to it that 5,000 people get fed. And we know it was really more than that. They were counting just the men, not the women and the kids, the families that were there. Huge crowd. But their response is practical. Jesus wants them to trust him. Their response is practical. Well, we only have these 5 loaves and these 2 fish. That wouldn't even feed the 12, let alone the enormous crowd that's gathered there. Bring them to me. Bring what little you have to Jesus. That's the way we need to approach God. We know that he's God and I'm not, and you're not. We're not God. So we bring what little we have, which came from him anyway, by the way. Your life, your breath, your talents, your skills, whatever resources you have, came from God anyway. They bring what little they have, which is, Andrew has taught that boy, and you know what? They don't talk about that too much. Andrew found the boy with the lunch that clearly mama or daddy have provided for him. The boy was willing to share. It's his lunch. He's willing to share. We're assuming Andrew, being a godly man, wouldn't snatch it from the child by force. But the boy is willing to share what his parents provided for him. He's hungry too. Maybe it's just barely enough to satisfy his 10, 11. We don't really know how old he is. He's a boy. We know that much. Maybe it's just barely enough to satisfy his little stomach. But he was willing to share. So we need to have that childlike willingness to share what little we have. He doesn't know Andrew. This strange man just walked up and asked him, would he be willing to share his lunch? Andrew's got a good bit of faith there. The boy's willing to share. Philip is like, where could we possibly buy food for this many people? Have them sit down. Bring it to me. That's what we need to be doing. Bringing what little we have to Jesus. and trust in Jesus for the outcome. And he directed the people to sit in the grass, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, recognizing the source from God above. Looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. None of the gospel accounts that deal with this record the disciples' reaction as they're handing out 5 little, like I said, biscuits, because the little barley loaves would not have been much bigger than your standard biscuit. And the more they keep giving, the more it keeps appearing. We're not recorded anywhere in the scriptures what their reaction is as the miracle keeps happening. But it keeps happening at least 5,000 times as each person gets something to eat out of that crowd. It probably took quite a while. When we have a fellowship here at the church, we have like 2, I guess they're like 8-foot tables here. And depending on how big our crowd is, we may leave the tables up against the wall and just go down one side of the serving line. Or if it's a really big crowd that day, we may pull it out a little bit and put spoons and tongs and forks and plates and napkins on both sides and let people go down both sides of the table just to get the crowd through the serving line quicker. Well, they don't have a serving line. They're sitting there. Jesus has just gotten off this boat at the Sea of Galilee, and they're on the hillside, and they're going up and fanning out around the hill. And the disciples are having to take this one kid's lunch and keep sharing and sharing and sharing and sharing and sharing times 5,000. And each and every time, the food miraculously continues to hold out. To the point we know from other scriptures that there are going to be 12 baskets of identifiable scraps left over, not counting something that was so reduced to crumb status that it fell down into the grass, and now the insects get to have their picnic lunch by some ant toting off back to his anthill a little morsel of bread. 12 baskets of leftovers. Their reaction isn't recorded on that. What we see here in Matthew is that everybody who was there that day got to eat until they were all satisfied. And what was the source? One child's lunch. 5 little loaves, 2 small fish. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftovers. Now the crowd's been fed. Now it's time for them to disperse for the day. They're going away to wherever they're going to spend the night. Whether they're going to go all the way back to wherever their village is, because there are numerous villages up that way, or whether they're going to camp out in one of the nearby towns just for the safety of the numbers. That part, we're not told. What's going to happen next is going to happen on the Sea of Galilee. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. How did this section open up? Jesus wanted to have a little bit of time alone to pray. And so he and the disciples had gone on the boat, but the people had followed him. They wouldn't let him go because they were getting their needs met. So he feeds the 5,000. Now he's told the disciples, you go ahead and get in the boat. You go over to the other side. Jesus stays behind and dismisses the crowd for the evening, and they're willing to go because they've been fed the word he's been teaching them. They've been fed in their bodies, and now they need rest too. So they're going to go home or go somewhere and spend the night. The crowd's gone one way. Jesus has sent the disciples out on the boat. The Sea of Galilee is about 13 miles wide and about 9 miles long. You can, wherever you are on the lake, you can see the other side of the lake. After he dismissed the crowd, Jesus finally gets that moment. He goes up alone into the mountains to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Because of the geographic location and the topography of the land, there are a couple of mountain passes where the wind comes through. They actually call one section of the Gospel Trail the Valley of the Wind. And so the wind coming in from a particular direction can cause a sudden storm to come up seemingly out of nowhere. Kind of like here where we're close to the Gulf Coast and it's summertime, when we get into the dog days of July and August, it can be perfectly sunny, clear blue skies in the morning, at noon, early afternoon. But because it gets into the 90s, the low 100s, what happens? Clouds start to form, and we can have sudden scattered thunder showers. You almost don't need to look at a weather forecast in July and August in the Wiregrass and in the Panhandle unless you're looking at tropical weather, because here's the forecast. It's going to be blazing saddles hot, and they're going to be scattered showers. And the rest of the time, it'll be steamy and sunny. That's the weather forecast. For months, that's the weather forecast. Sea of Galilee, sudden storms can come up out of nowhere, just like we can have these sudden storms come up in our area. The disciples are out there in the boat. Jesus is not in the boat. He sent them ahead. It's starting to be buffeted by the wind and the waves because the wind's against it. The first time I had a chance to go to Israel, we put out onto the Sea of Galilee, because everybody, if you ever get a chance to go, everybody's tour is going to take you up to try to do a boat ride on the Sea of Galilee. Because if you're a pilgrim going to Israel to see the places that Jesus went and ministered, you have got to spend some time at the Galilee. Well, the first time we went, it happened to be a very calm day, and we were able to put in from the west side, which is where they now have a museum, where they have housed a first century fishing boat called the Jesus boat. We don't know if it was the one that Jesus himself used, but it is definitely a first century fishing boat. It was buried in the mud, and they found it in 1986 when Israel had gone through such a severe drought that the lake waters, because that's their freshwater source for the entire country. It's also the freshwater source for the country of Jordan. So a lot of people are taking water out of the Galilee and the Jordan River. Lake levels had dropped. And a couple of brothers who worked at a kibbutz on the southwest side were walking along the shore, and they noticed this dark object in the water. And like anybody in Israel has to do, you see something buried in the water, buried on your land. You want to build something on your land, you have to call in the Antiquities Authority, the archaeologists, because they need to check it out before you build so that you don't have to tear down what you've built if you happen to accidentally build over something important. Here come the archaeologists. They discover that it is a first century fishing boat that's underneath that water. And they were able to put this foam stuff around it. I have put that link up on our social media pages before. I'll see if I can find it again on YouTube and put it up sometime this week, because it was really fascinating that they had to go and have people dive under the water and encase this boat remains in this hard foam-like substance. And then they raised it and they floated it over to near their kibbutz, and they built a museum around it. And over the course of several years, they had to take the foam down and replace it with some wax in the parts where the boat was still partially attacked, but they didn't want it to fall apart. And now it's on display in this museum. We were able to get out on the sea that day, perfectly calm. The next time I went to Israel, we were supposed to go and start from that same location and go out on the sea. But as soon as we drove up towards the sea and we saw what the conditions looked like, the tour guide, the bus driver, the tour leader, and I, because I was the bus captain for that tour and the assistant tour leader, we saw it and we knew instantly, they're not going to let us out on the water today because one of those sudden storms had come up. So the tour guide is on the phone and she's quickly rearranging our schedule. We're not getting on the water that day. It's just not going to be safe. So she rearranged us to go to the baptism site up there. Well, some of us were bummed, including me, true confession here. I mean, I've already had the chance to be on the Sea of Galilee. But most of the people on that trip, this was their one-time trip of a lifetime opportunity. And they hadn't had a chance to be on the sea. So I was more bummed for them. Oh man, I hope the weather holds up tomorrow. We know that Zippy's on the phone and she's doing what tour guides do. We can't do this today, so let's see if we can shuffle the schedule. As it turns out, when we got to the Jordan River, we had a divine appointment waiting for us right then and there. We were there. There were some people in our group who wanted to renew their baptism. We had several ministers and missionaries on the trip, and a couple of them had agreed to go get in the river and conduct the baptisms. Now, this was October, so the water was a little cooler than it would be like in August. But they had agreed to go get in the water and let the ones who wanted to renew their baptismal vows do it. What we didn't know was what God had planned for us that day. And you see, the disciples didn't know what God had planned for them. And the people who had followed Jesus around the lake didn't know what God had planned for them. They had gotten fed. They had gotten their physical needs met. They had gotten their spiritual needs met for the day. They're ready to go lay down and go to sleep. The disciples, all of a sudden, immediately in the aftermath of this wonderful day when they've been a part of the miracle, because they're the ones passing out the bread and the fish that keeps multiplying. They've had a small part of the miracle. And now all of a sudden, they're on a sea that has suddenly turned very stormy and very violent. They went from the high experience of being part of a miracle to now, we're in trouble here. We're in danger here. Wonder if we're going to survive or drown in the lake type moment. They have gone from that emotional high to now, all of a sudden they're in fear for their safety. And Jesus is not with them physically. They're stressed. They're worried. We didn't know we had that divine appointment at the Jordan River. Some of us were like bummed out. Oh God, please tomorrow let the weather be good. Because our schedule will only allow for this much flex. If the weather's not good tomorrow, Lord, then we're going to have to move on down to the other part of our tour. And these people won't get to have their experience on the Sea of Galilee. So some of us are there kind of stressing over that, even while we're watching people get baptized in the river from our own group. This family comes up. They are from the country of Georgia. They have 2 children. One of the 2 children is a 13-year-old boy who is severely crippled with cerebral palsy. They're pushing him in a giant stroller that's built for him. The father didn't speak English at all, but one of the missionaries on our trip had done mission work in some of the former Soviet republics, which Georgia and the Ukraine and places like that were part of. And he spoke enough of the Russian language to understand what this family wanted. This family was on a personal trip to Israel. Their children had become believers. They wanted their son and daughter to get baptized. The daughter could walk, but the son was severely crippled. He couldn't get into the water by himself. His dad had to lift him out of the stroller and carry him in his arms. And they had been praying that God would provide a minister to perform the baptism. Well, there we are, sitting on the side of the Jordan River, and there are two of our ministers in the river doing rebaptisms for our people. And one of them, Jim, was able to have just enough conversation with the Father to understand what he wanted. And so he performs the baptism. We have pictures of it. There wasn't a dry eye anywhere in our group or in any of the groups around us when they figured out what was going on. See, it took our group a minute to figure it out. And there were other groups, because they have several places where you can get baptized there. And those other groups, they were doing their thing, but it became kind of obvious. Here is this very severely crippled young boy, 13. And when his father is carrying him in his arms into the river, it's cold. And the boy expressed when you first step into some very cold water. The two ministers who were in the river, it took both of them to get him down and back up, along with Daddy's help. They got him down quickly. They got him up very quickly. And he immediately stopped the crying out from the coldness of it. And his father carries him out of the river. They wrap him up to dry him off, because it's not chilly on the land, but it's October. It's late October, and it's chilly in the water. And everybody realized we had a divine appointment there. But the miracle wasn't over there, because there was another tour group that was in the same location, but for whatever reason, they didn't have a minister among their tour group. They were from the Philippines. They wanted to be baptized too. They were hoping that somebody would be there, and if not, they would just go in and immerse themselves, which, by the way, is a very Jewish thing to do, to go down into the water yourself and come up. But, they had a plan B, because they didn't have a minister in their tour group. Well, we've got ministers in the tour group, and they could tell that Constantine, that was the boy's name, and his family weren't part of our tour group. So one of them comes over, and they ask, would our guys mind baptizing their people too? And all of a sudden, we're having a mass baptism there, and our two ministers in the water are baptizing person after person after person after person. And the next day, it was just barely clear enough for us to be able to take the boat ride. Not from where we wanted to. They didn't get to see the Jesus boat. We had to go on the western side and take a boat there that got maybe 100 yards offshore. You're sort of floating on the very edge of it, but at least they got the boat ride in. We had our divine encounters. The 12 disciples who've been with Jesus, who've been sent out by him ahead into these towns and villages to prepare the way, who've been given authority from Jesus to do healings themselves, who got to participate in the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, who've been sent ahead by Jesus. And out of the 12, 4 of them are by profession fishermen. And now they're out on the lake, and they're in trouble, because one of those sudden storms has come up, and the boat is getting swamped, and their fisherman buddies aren't able to bring things under control, just like they weren't able to bring things under control the time that Jesus was sleeping in the boat with them. Well, this time, Jesus is not in the boat with them for them to wake him up and say, don't you care that we're about to drown? This time, they think they're all alone. They're not. He's with them in ways that they don't even understand. Sometimes when you're going through tough times and you think you're all alone, you think God has left you behind or is ignoring you, God's with you in ways that you can't even imagine yet. They're about to have that kind of a moment. Verse 25. During the fourth watch of the night, that would be like the 3 to 6 a.m. period of time frame. They divide the period from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. into watches. This would be the last one, the fourth watch of the night. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they're terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and they cried out in fear. Well, we can reasonably understand why they would be afraid. That's never happened before. They haven't seen Jesus walk on water until this point. But Jesus immediately said to them, he didn't wait and listen to them and stand back and see if they were going to show some faith in him. He immediately reassured them because he can hear them. Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." Of those 12, Peter, Mr. Impulsive, speaks up. "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." Peter wants to be able to do what Jesus can do. And Jesus says, "Come." And Peter gets out of the boat. And he's walking on water too, while he's looking at Jesus. But he takes his eye off Jesus for a moment. And what immediately happens? He starts to sink. And he realizes he's sinking. And he cries out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand, caught him, and said, "You have little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Just like that. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." They're going to continue their journey and they're going to cross over the lake. This is 2021. 2019, we were doing VBS out at the chapel where I then worked. I didn't know then that a month after VBS was over with, they were going to come back again and say, well, the budget is going to be cut and your position is going to go away. They had told me that the year before, and then they had changed their mind and left the money in the budget. This time it was really going to happen. But we were doing VBS, and we included being able to walk on water. There's a way you can mix the right amount of liquid cornstarch and water, and it forms something called oobleck, which is a non-Newtonian fluid, where if you stand still on it, it'll act like a liquid and you'll sink. But if you keep moving, the properties of it acts like a solid, and you can walk on water. There's at least one person sitting in the room right here who had the experience herself of walking on the water because she was a VBS volunteer, and we let the kids do it. And our science guy, Mr. Barker, demonstrated it first. Here are these kids. They were kindergarten to 6th grade, so we're looking like 5 to 11 and 12-year-olds. Each class that came through there, Mr. Barker would show them that, yes, you can walk on this. We had one guy, Glenn, down on the ground. He spent hours just waving his hand and keeping it stirred up, because you have to keep the oobleck pool stirred up. If you don't, it's going to harden up on you. So Glenn spent hours just stirring the liquid, and they can see it's liquid. Then Mr. Barker starts running across it, and they see this grown man able to walk on it. Now it's their turn. And he's standing there and he's telling them, look, we've got this little area lined out. Start running and just keep moving. And some of the kids would run and they'd get up a good run, but they'd get right to the edge of where the oobleck pool began, and they'd come to a dead stop. 2 or 3 times, some of them will try to do that. Once or twice, Mr. Barker would hold out his hand and say, nope, you got to keep moving. They'd come running, they'd take his hand, and he'd help them run across it. Then, when they saw their peers doing it, some of them started to do it, and they would finally start running. And once they had done it once, now they can't wait to get back in line. They don't want to go wash off their feet. and put their shoes back on, they want to get back in line. They saw it. They saw somebody a whole lot bigger than them, a grown man, able to walk on water. They're 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years of age. They're nowhere near as big or as heavy as the adult man. But when they got up to the edge of the pool, some of them, their brains kicked in and they're like, I can't do this. Well, on their own, they can't. But if you have the right mixture of cornstarch and water in there, yes, you can. The other 11 in the boat, in the storm, seeing Jesus walking out there, they don't want to get out of the boat. Peter is at least willing to get out of the boat and to try. And he was doing just fine until what moment? The moment he decided to take his eyes off of Jesus. At that exact moment, down he went. But did he drown? No, because Jesus reached out, pulled him back up to where he was, and they step into the boat together. And the minute they're in the boat, the storm dies down. These disciples have just had a divine encounter of their own, that Jesus is taking care of them. They're going to need that kind of trust in Jesus. Even when they can't explain it, they can't understand it. If somebody asked Peter afterwards, and nowhere in the scriptures does it record for us that Matthew or Andrew or James or any of the others asked Peter, hey man, what was it like to be out there walking on the water with Jesus? We don't know whether any of them were sorry that they didn't ask, hey, can we come too? Because that was the reaction of our kids at VBS. Once they saw the first couple of kids in their class run across the Oobleck pool, then they were ready to run across the pool. And once they'd done it once, they wanted to keep doing it again and again and again. And the big disappointment was when we told them, no, tribe of Reuben or tribe of Joseph or tribe of whoever, it is time for you to go to some other activity because the next group is coming out and it's their turn to be in the Oobleck pool. We don't have any recording in the scriptures of any of the other 11 saying out loud, asking Peter, wishing to themselves, man, I missed that opportunity. I should have done that. But they are learning with each encounter with Jesus, as he's preaching, as he's teaching, they're learning what the scriptures really mean. As he's sending them out and they're doing things in his power, they're learning to take those baby steps of faith, because the day is going to come when he's going to set his face towards Jerusalem. And the crowds that are around now are going to start to go away as he starts talking about the cross. Next week, when we're in Luke chapter 9, Jesus is going to talk to his disciples and ask them, are you going to leave too? And Peter's going to respond in faith, where will we go? You have the words of life. And we're going to see from Luke 9 and 10 that Jesus is going to begin to set his face toward Jerusalem and head down there, knowing that he's going there to suffer at the hands of man, to die on the cross, to complete the plan of redemption. Jesus was willing to follow the plan, even unto death on the cross, to the grave, to Sheol, to preach to those who were there, to ascend back to his throne in heaven. We're going to follow the gospel trail all the way through. See you next week.